And finally, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the day. Bethanne Patrick is a writer and book critic who you may know her as the Book Maven for her blog and her at the Book Maven Twitter, Instagram, everything handle, at the Book Maven. She just joined the board of directors of Penn Faulkner, one of our sister literary arts organizations in the DC area. And you're working on a memoir for Counterpoint Press, was it? For Counterpoint Press. Everyone, here is Bethanne Patrick. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you all. Thanks for being here. Today we're talking about strong female protagonists, and as we all know, there can never be enough of them. And I'm really pleased to be joined by these 4 women who happen to be local, but whose fiction covers women all over the world. And I'm going to introduce each of them and then ask each author to describe her book to you in a little more detail. We'll have some reading, and we'll also have some questions and then time for plenty of your questions. So welcome, sit back. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be having some laughs, I think. But first, the bona fides. Solveig Eggerz, a native of Iceland, who is down at the end in the white sweater. I'm going from right to left. Has published 2 novels, Seal Woman and Sigga of Reykjavik. She teaches creative writing for the Writers' Center and for Herd, an Alexandria nonprofit that serves at-risk populations. Welcome, Solveig. Thank you for being here. I think we can clap all we want for everyone. So, a DC native, author Leslie Rollins, who's sitting to Solveig's left. She pays her bills being a graphic designer, but follows her heart by writing. She has published 2 novels, The Man Dance, a coming-of-age novel that's set in 1960s Britain, and Good Time Girl, a work of humorous fiction. Welcome, Leslie. Next to Leslie is Alice Stevens, whose debut novel, Famous Adopted People, was published by Unnamed Press in 2018. She is a contributing editor to Bloom and writes book reviews and a column in Alice in Wordland, excuse me, I'm stumbling over my words, for the Washington Independent Review of Books. So welcome, Alice. Thanks for being here as well. And last but very much not least is Melanie S. Hatter, who's an award-winning author of 2 novels and 1 short story collection. Selected by Edwige Danticat, her novel Malawi Sisters won the inaugural Kimbilio National Fiction Prize, published by 4-Way Books in March of 2018. Thanks, Melanie. Great to have you with us. So I am, as I said, going to ask each author to describe her current book, the latest one that we're discussing today. So for Solveig, that will be Sigga of Reykjavik. Would you tell us a little bit about that novel?
So Sigga of Reykjavik is really about Iceland. It's about the history of Iceland in the 20th century, the struggle for independence. Interestingly, to me, the occupation of Iceland by Allied forces in World War II. But it's a story about a woman who faces enormous adversity and how she interacts with that. So I'm going to, for me, a strong woman should also be physically strong, at least in this case.
We'll talk more about that.
This is the first paragraph of the book, chapter 1. This is when Sigga is 10 years old and she's living on a farm, and as a poor hired hand, she's experienced some abuse, which was common, and she is angry about it, and wants to fight back. I was in the shed shoveling cow dung. When I heard the new calf bawl for its mother, I entered its dark pen, placed my arms under its soft belly, buried my nose in its spicy smell, and raised it off the ground. When I set it down, it nuzzled me. I rubbed the strings of saliva into my sweater so Mama wouldn't notice. She didn't like the lifting, didn't believe I needed to build my strength to defend against the men on the farm. I was 10 years old, but one day I would be Sigga the Strong and break somebody's jaw.
Thank you. Leslie, Good Time Time Girl. Tell us about it.
Okay. Oh, okay. Forgive me having notes so that I don't blank out and make a total fool of myself. Okay, Good Time Girl is set locally. It takes place in 2003. It's 1 year in the life of Leah Mason, who's a 48-year-old graphic designer. And being 48, she's going through the perimenopause, and she's feeling powerless. She's been passed over at work, so she's feeling a bit invisible at work. She's feeling invisible to men as a single woman, and she's feeling powerless. So, and she's also a frustrated feminist, disgusted that women are buying and wearing thong underwear. So, despite her seeing a shrink, being a homeowner, having a couple of lovely dogs, it isn't until she impulsively purchases a handgun that she feels his first surges of power. And she starts seducing a neighbor, a much younger man, and ends up making other impulsive decisions that land her in hot water. So, into my passage. All right, this is Leah being predatory. She isn't always predatory, but in this instance. April unfurls. It's one of those sunny Saturdays, like the entire world is in a jovial mood. My tree-lined neighborhood is bright with the antifreeze glow of tender new growth, and the eyesore of a double-parked U-Haul. I focus my binoculars out my front bedroom window, dodging the pesky foliage. Someone is moving into one of the townhouses across the street, the one with all the roommates. He is a promising sapling, lean with tanned skin, a cute face but for the damned acne. But he's too thin. Still, the raw materials are good. In 6 months, he could bloom. Hoochie mama, is that a big root in those baggy sweats? Time to water the bushes. Hi, I call out, hose in hand, after unwinding it from that hose thingy on the front deck. The boy pauses down the ramp and squints at me. Moving in? I say like the sort of nosy hen neighbor I hate. Sweat stains his t-shirt. Yeah, he says. Would you like some water? Nah, thanks. I can get some, inside. He indicates his new residence. Lemonade? I press brightly. I can see he wants to get away. I probably look like someone's mom, though that renders me safe, like camouflage. I hold my cheerful expression as if I have cookies, freshly baked and cooling on the stove in the kitchen. Sure, he says, and puts down his box.
So, Alice.
So my book is Famous Adopted People, and it is about a transracial adoptee like me, but unlike me, her name is Lisa, and she lives in Japan. Her best friend is also a transracial adoptee. Transracial adoptee means somebody who's adopted into a family of another race. And her best friend wants to find her birth mother and asks Lisa to come along to Korea for that meeting. Lisa's in a bit of an identity crisis. She's also a party girl, and they get into a big argument and pretty much break up. And so on impulse, Lisa then takes a trip with a handsome stranger and wakes up in North Korea. I'm going to read from the end of my book, but there are no spoiler alerts. No spoilers. As adoptees, we know that truth is a squishy thing. Stories are told, myths created, and throughout constant repetition, we come to accept them as real. When we were children, our parents offered us an explanation about how we came into the family, a charming origin story freighted with fate, destiny, and other hazy cosmic forces that purported to join these particular parents with that particular child, as if truly they belonged to each other all along. From an early age, we are used to looking upon ourselves as a character in a story, but not the most important one. In the dominant narrative of adoption, the protagonists are the adoptive parents and the adoptees are the catalyst for the plot, which revolves around the Herculean labors the parent heroes must perform in order to obtain the object of their desire. Those stories end with a happily ever after at exactly the point that our stories begin, with the baby being brought home. We all know there is no happily ever after. As children of chance, we understand that it's not a kumbaya world out there, and that not everything happens for the best. There's a lot of loose talk about fate in adoption circles. We were fated to be adopted by the perfect loving couple, or fated to be reunited with our heart-sick birth mother. But sometimes the loving couple gets divorced, or the birth mother's heart is too sick to give us the love that we crave. Fate isn't real. It's a literary device, a retroactive designation. You can't be fated to be something until you have actually become it. Fate is what you make of your own life. It's hard, dirty work. Every day is another slog up a snow-swept mountain. Every day you have to prove yourself to yourself all over again.
Yes, indeed. Malawi Sisters was inspired by a true story. A young black woman was shot and killed by a white man. This happened in Michigan. And when the headlines came out, I started thinking about sort of what happens to the families, what's the story behind the headlines. So this book really takes a look at a family, a DC-based family, and how they deal with a shooting like this in the family. So it's focused on, it comes from the point of view of 4 of the family members, the parents and the 2 surviving sisters. And I'm going to read a scene here that introduces you a little bit to 2 of the sisters. Let's see if I can. I swear, I really did prepare. Okay. So there, Kenya and Malawi is the sister who was killed. Kenya and Ghana are the 2 surviving sisters. Kenya rummaged in her purse for a tissue and pressed it firmly on her forefinger, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to be discreet. Chewing the skin until it bled was a habit she had never understood and struggled to stop. She folded over the tissue and dabbed the clean side on her temple. The temperature was hotter than she'd expected, and she knew the back of her dress was soaked with perspiration. She looked around, hoping no one was paying attention to her, despite sitting on a stage before a mass of people. She hoped she still appeared cute and stylish. Signs bobbed and swayed above the crowd. Justice for Malawi, make an arrest, Black Lives Matter, Black Women Matter. Something about that last one stung. Until now, she hadn't seen any headlines about Black women being killed by cops or vigilantes. She was sure her sister wasn't the first and wondered if the news media didn't consider the deaths of Black women as newsworthy enough. Black women did matter. They were mothers and daughters and sisters and wives. Ghana was graceful as she stepped to the microphone, and this surprised Kenya. Her sister was eloquent, strong, passionate, all the things Kenya wished to be. Ghana was free to be anything she wanted. In high school and college, Kenya panicked whenever she got a B. The fact that Ghana never got her bachelor's degree dumbfounded Kenya, who would never have gotten away with not graduating. But then look at her life. She got paid by the hour and probably had no health insurance. That was no security. There was no security in that kind of a life. Speeches and more speeches. Then everyone would march to the courthouse to demand the arrest of Jeffrey Davis, who apparently hadn't been seen since the shooting. Too many of us are dying, Ghana said, her voice echoing through the speakers into the air. My sister will not die in vain. We must demand change. The crowd burst into applause, and Kenya nudged her daughter to a sitting position and clapped her hands with a sudden burst of energy. The balled-up, bloody tissue fell to her feet, and a breeze shifted it toward the edge of the stage, causing Kenya to panic. She watched it teeter like a red-spotted carnation, afraid of it being blown into the audience. Then her father stood up, drawing her back into the moment, and she looked at Ghana, who glanced back, perhaps seeking reassurance or checking to make sure everyone was still awake. And Kenya stood up to applaud, forgetting the tissue. Her sister was a superstar.
Thank you all. It's wonderful when you have a panel and the writing is so different but so strong among all of the authors, and that is a real treat for me as a moderator. I hope it was a treat for the audience as well. And so the questions I have in talking about strong female protagonists are going to be answered very differently, but I look forward to hearing the four of you speak to each other as well as to me. And of course, the first one, and we have been to this rodeo at least once together before, some of you more than once. What defines a strong female protagonist? And we know, Solveig, as you said, strength, physical strength is something very important to you and your concept, at least for this protagonist, maybe for all.
Courage, sure, but I want a character who's assertive and sort of edgy and aggressive, and the kind of woman I'd like to be.
All right, that's a pretty great answer overall.
But I want her to be so angry, too, that she gets strength from her anger, physical strength. And that's what I was trying to show in the book.
So
I mean,
not
it goes
just the
into your
muscles,
arms.
but
Yeah.
the adrenaline.
Yes, yes.
I really like that. For a while, my Twitter bio just started with angry feminist, and I probably will change it back after today. Now, Leslie, how about you? It's not just about goodness in the case of your protagonist here.
Heavens no.
However we define that, maybe.
In relation to my character, I like that she's flawed, and yet she's still fighting the good fight. She's got the drive to wake up every morning despite the odds being against her. And like Siga, she has a lot of rage in her as well from being overlooked. And I kind of wrote about her because I didn't see female heroines surfacing in novels who were nearing 50 and who also were single. Usually it's a mom with a husband and kids, and I was married too when I was writing this, but she was single, and I was just thinking about how tricky that could be once you reach that age. So just the fact that she's still sort of fighting the good fight and trying to get notice is, to me, feels strong.
Definitely. And how about for you, Alice?
So I wrote my book sort of in reaction to a lot of other adoption books that are out there, adoption novels, that place the adoptee as the object of the story and not the subject. And the adoptee is somebody who must be rescued either by her birth parents, her adoptive parents who take her out of her bad situation and give her a lovely fairy tale ending, or by her birth mother who somehow connects with her against all odds and you know makes the universe right for everybody. So I purposely wanted to make my protagonist somebody who solved her own problems, who fought her own battles, and who was not rescued by anybody. She had to rescue herself.
Very, very important. And Melanie, of course, Malawi, who's in the title, dies, but she's still an extremely important character in the novel, and I would say she's also one of the strong women who are being described. But tell us a little bit about your concept.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because I don't think of my characters as strong versus weak, but looking back at them, they are. And I think the strength comes from how they sort of drive their lives, how they're able to continue to move forward, how they experience such horrific tragedy and experience what they experience just because they're human, but are able to move forward and kind of reinvent themselves in some ways. And I think we do learn who Malawi was through her sisters and her father. Her father is a character here too. But, you know, her sisters and her mother really, they go through quite a journey. And, you know, I think they're able to kind of come out on the other side of it.
You know, reinvention, self-determination, assertion, and strength. But Solveig and Leslie, you both spoke about anger and rage. And I think all of the characters have some anger, which is really important in the context of being a woman, and especially being a woman who has anything. Well, we all have things against us. I was going to say, you know, race, ethnicity, circumstance, but let's face it, you know, it's
Just being a woman.
Just being a woman, yes, exactly. So let's talk a little bit about, and I can't remember which of you said it, forgive me, we were talking about the fact that, I think it was you, Melanie, that, oh, well, I didn't realize I was writing a strong female character versus weak. But when did each of you realize that you weren't just writing another novel with a character who happened to be female, but the female was going to be someone who had to be strong, had to assert herself somehow, had to reinvent her life, and so on? When did that come up for you in the process?
That's a
Yeah, go.
What a great question. You know, I'm not sure where that sort of hit me, and it may not have hit me until the end. But I knew, what I was curious about was just how do you keep it together, or do you keep it together when you lose someone, whether it's a daughter or a sister? And I sort of was exploring that as I was writing it. And I think being able to sort of see these three women move through their grief and in each of their own ways, because they battle one another, they're battling all kinds of things in the story, but being able to get to the end and have some sense of peace, I guess.
Resolution.
Some sort of resolution. I don't know. It never goes away, of course, when you're talking about grief like that, but they were able to kind of find themselves. And I think it was really at the end I was able to look back and kind of see their journeys. But I also feel that, and maybe I was lucky in that all of the women in my life have been strong women, but I've never looked at them and said, oh yeah, my mother's really strong, or my aunt's really strong. They just are.
Right.
And because they go through life, they're human, and you know, they find their ways. And I think that's always kind of with me because it's what I grew up with. And so the characters that I write tend to be that way as well.
And sometimes, as you said, it can come from life. Other times, it can come from a specific event. For instance, Solveig, you were covering World War II and this history of a very tough time for Iceland, and also a transitional point in the country going from old ways, if you will, to modernity. And so did that influence Sigga a great deal?
Oh yes, tremendously, because Sigga really grew out of my concern with the occupation of Iceland, which in May 10th, 1940, when the British arrived, this marked Iceland's coming out of isolation. So it was a very exciting and dangerous time. And I started my novel actually with a man as the main character. Fritz was the main character. He was a Jewish refugee. But I realized he wasn't strong enough. And it had to be a woman who was really experiencing these difficulties of exploiting the occupation, but also protecting her daughter from soldiers. So I already had a plot.
Well, and a plot that would bring up a lot of female rage when you see your daughter, being threatened. So that's a wonderful example. Alice, for you, Lisa's plight clearly comes out of something you've done a great deal of thought and reading about. But when you started working on Famous Adopted People, when did you realize that this was about her strength in enduring this? Was that before you began to write, or was there a moment for you?
I mean, I guess I never really considered not writing a strong character. They're the interesting ones, and if you're going to write a whole book, you better write it about somebody who you identify with and you like, and who's going to move the plot along. And for me, that would be somebody who was a strong female character. In writing the book, it was just kind of one of these things that I just sat down to do. I'd written a book before that hadn't sold, a lovely historical fiction novel, which I'm still hoping to publish. But it didn't get published, and then I said, well, God damn it, I'm going to write something that's going to get published. I'm going to write what I know, and I'm going to sit down and write a story that's not been written before.
Strong female author.
Exactly. And so it just kind of poured out of me. The story just kind of came out of me, and it wasn't like I sat down, she's going to be a strong female character. It's just like, that's the way that it all came out.
I love that. I love that. And Leslie, as we've discussed already, you knew that you had a character who was not going to be someone who conforms to quote unquote good or decent or anything behavior. She has a lot of urges, and some she's very proud of, some not so proud of, and she is going to follow through on them. She's definitely in the category of the less likable characters, although it's impossible not to love her when you meet her and you read your writing. So what was your concept as you were writing about how you were going to make her seem not just someone who put forth whatever she wanted, her desires, but also someone who had some strength to draw on, because she goes through some tough times?
I prefer to write from the male viewpoint, but I ended up writing from the female viewpoint by hitting middle age. And I like men, I'm walking my dogs, and I'm thinking, oh, brother, here comes some guy, he's gonna look at me, and he doesn't. And that started to happen a lot. And then I'd be at work, and I'd been at work a long time, but people weren't really looking at me or listening to me or passing over me, and the employees that I was managing were projecting their mothers on me, and it was just a bad situation. So I don't know, I guess I kind of snapped. I was trying to get another book into a pitching agents class in New York City, and the guy I was talking to was rejecting my entry because it wasn't chick lit, this was the early 2000s, so it was Bridget Jones' Diary era, and he wanted me to change it, and I didn't want to change it. And so he announced to me that you will never be published. I was so pissed off at that point. It's like, okay, dude, I'll write you your chick lit, and it's bitch lit. Because
That's a great...
I made Leah the Antichrist of chick lit, and she's just too old and too kind of
too horny, too
horny, going after men too young. So there's no perfect Mr. Right. Anyway, that really poured out of me in a fury, and so that's how she was born. Yeah.
Thank you. I love bitchlet. Please, can we make this a marketing category for someone? I think more bitchlet should be written. But in what you're saying, Leslie, comes my next question, which is, well, actually something for each of you to talk about. Leah isn't necessarily likable, or, and all of these characters have moments when they are not likable. That isn't the question per se, but it's about the other characters who find them difficult, the other characters who find them to be people they don't want to deal with. And it could be when a character is behaving in a completely mannerly fashion, but it's because she's a strong woman who is saying, this is what I need. So let's talk about some of your other characters and why they have difficulties with something that your protagonist or characters in general have.
Yeah, so I guess Bet is the mother in this story, who is probably the most challenging character. She was actually the most challenging one to write as well. She really goes into denial, and I guess you can sort of argue whether or not she's strong. But she withdraws, basically. She's lost her daughter, and she has a secret that she is grappling with, and that really kind of pulls her down. And as a result of that, she goes, up against both her husband and her daughters, who really battle with her. Ghana, who's the middle child, they've always had a little bit of an antagonistic relationship, and that kind of comes to a head. And, Kenya is the oldest one, who's always sort of been the one to, do the right thing. She sort of, models herself after her father in many cases. And she's trying to help her mother and get her through this time, but her Bet is just refusing really any kind of help. She doesn't want it. She wants to sort of go into her darkness and just wallow there. And so, I wanted to sort of explore, how do you, as a family unit, I mean, you have issues in families. If anyone doesn't have issues in families, I want to talk to you afterwards. So everyone's got stuff. But then here comes this, not just a tragic situation, but one that gets into headlines because it becomes this bigger sort of national issue that's kind of happening across the country. And Malawi becomes this sort of martyr now. Well, how do you, as an older sister who always kind of resented her, how do you now deal with these emotions that you've had and, all of these sort of interpersonal issues you have with your family when the world is saying, they're going to marches for Malawi. Say, she becomes this sort of headline that's not who they remember her to be, and so it becomes a bit of a challenge for the family members to deal with that.
And what you were just saying about headlines, I think, Alice, we have to talk about North Korea, right? Because Lisa does wind up there, and Lisa is, it deals with a couple of characters, including a woman, her mother. No, I won't do any more spoilers, but she's quite a character. And so the fact that Lisa has wound up in this country that is, part of the geopolitical landscape and headlines is part of her story, but it's not really her true story. Does that make sense? And in terms of the people who find her difficult to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, North Korea has nothing to do with her origin story. Right. It's just that's kind of where she ends up, and it was a good illustration for me just to write about my view of the geopolitical scene today. And In this book is basically my philosophy about, everything, life, consumerism, plastic surgery, just everything is in there. But I think that for Lisa, the person who dislikes her the most is herself. And she does not like herself, and this book is her struggle to come to like herself. And she doesn't like herself, and that is kind of reinforced by what other people see about her. So she was raised in a family, she was raised to be white, but she's not white. And that kind of, that conflict shapes her as she grows up and gives her all sorts of identity issues that she lets fester and she doesn't take care of. So other people dislike her because she's obnoxious and she doesn't care, what they think about her, and she basically just does whatever she wants. But in the end, it's that she herself doesn't like herself, and that's what she has to fix.
Really important point. Very interesting. Thank you. And Leslie, of course, Leah, there's all kinds of people who don't like her, her former subordinates, people in the neighborhood, on and on it goes. What was it like to create someone who would be in opposition? Bitch-lit, it sounds like that's the founding tenet of it, to create a character who's really in opposition to as many people as possible and see her figure out what's important for her in the situation.
Yeah, that was the challenge, boy. Fortunately, I have a sadistic writers group, and I would submit my work to them, and they would say, no, it's too much, she's terrible, or they would say, yeah, keep going, this is great. But I wanted to mention in my book, there's a conflict between Leah and her mother, who loves her, finds her hard to deal with because Leah is old and she's not married, and she's not feminine enough, and what have you. And similarly, my character Leah is also pissed off at the younger generation of women who are wearing thong underwear and listening to misogynist rap lyrics, and she doesn't get it. And so that kind of interested me, this sort of domino effect of, how women look at each other. So.
Very interesting. And for Siga and her daughter and her mother, Solveig, there is, in fact, we could have a whole other panel series on mothers and daughters in these books. Their note to self. There is a lot of intergenerational dislike, misunderstanding, miscommunication. And so how did that play into creating your protagonist?
Well, Siga's mother, of course, is completely taken aback when she realizes that she's produced this daughter who just opposes everything on the farm, all these people who are groping her and touching her.
The sleeping arrangements on this Icelandic farm are just unbelievable.
Oh, yes. Well, everyone slept in the same room, and then the calves were downstairs, and you could feel their heat through the panels in the floor. So Siga was always close to the calf that she was practicing lifting every day in order to get that strength that she needed. But for Siga to behave in this rebellious way was, in the mother's view, extremely dangerous, because they would just be put out and they'd have nothing. And so Siga was being very, very different from the way anybody would have responded to the abuse that she was receiving. But I learned about this by reading the master's thesis of a person who wrote an anthropological master's thesis, and this was like a bombshell when those beautiful, idyllic Icelandic farms were also these havens where little girls and women were not treated so well. But fortunately, one of them rebels.
Yes, fortunately. And I want to make sure that we have time for you all to ask questions, but I have other questions we can ask if we don't get a lot of audience ones. But in the meantime, because I don't want to go by without hearing from each of you about what you're working on now and what we can look forward to next. So before I open it up to your questions, anyone who would like to start, go right ahead.
Yeah, I am working on some personal stories. It's a whole string of personal stories, and I'm trying to get my my writers group to like these stories. I'm promoting them as a memoir.
First step to publication.
But these are really stories that I sometimes tell orally, and then I write, and back and forth, you know, it's between the oral and the written tradition. So that's where I am.
Looking forward to those. I am.
It's a scary place.
Yeah, and I have a whole other novel called The Man Dance with a male protagonist who's growing up in an abuse situation, and he becomes famous and has this love relationship. But anyway, I'm working on the sequel to it, and that's just poured out of me. I've just finished it, and I'm feeling very strong about it, but it's going to a professional editor in January, and we'll find out what she thinks of it.
Fantastic.
So I'm going back to historical fiction. I had a manuscript that didn't get published, and this is it's a duology. This is a historical fiction novel based on Isamu Noguchi, who is a Japanese-American artist and visionary, and the 6 months that he spent in an internment camp in Arizona during World War II.
Wow. So speaking of mother-daughter stories, that's what I'm working on now. It's actually done. I've gone through 5 million rewrites of it, and I think I'm finished now. So yes, I'll be submitting that, and fingers crossed that someone will love it and publish it.
Well, at least your writers group, start there. So I'm going to open it up to questions from you all. Now, because of the recording here at the Writers Center, I'd ask you to be as clear and slow as possible when you state your question. But if anyone else can't hear, I'll be sure to repeat it so that you all can. So first question, right here.
Yeah, I wondered if this is a question for each of you, if you could talk about how you show through your writing that your characters are strong, because, you know, are you doing it through dialogue? Are you doing it through the eyes of another character? Are you doing it through physical description? Are you doing it through action? Are you doing it, I mean, how are you showing that they're strong? Because you talked about, well, they're strong, they're physically strong or whatever, but as a writer, how do you show that?
And did everyone hear that? Okay, great.
I'll go. The way I do it is I have my character is always grappling with very difficult historical circumstances, very difficult economic situations, and she just takes it on and she just does it. And she wades right into it. Or if she doesn't get to learn how to sew a corset, which is her dream, she becomes a fish woman, and she becomes the best fish woman there ever was, and she sells fish, and she dries and washes fish, and so that I feel I'm showing her strength by how she interacts with life as it comes towards her.
So it's character development.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I'd say that the best way to show it is through the plot and through her actions and what she does and how she reacts to what fate has thrown at her. You know, but you try to kind of sew it all together so it's not just one thing that's carrying it. You want all little hints to go in through various things, the action or how other people see her. You don't want to just have like one obvious trance. You want everything to kind of gel together so you get that whole.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's sort of everything that you talked about in terms of, for me, how each of the sisters are sort of viewing one another, how, you know, they're viewing their mother, so you kind of get to see them through the other's eyes, but also through their own decision-making, through their own actions, and through, you know, some I don't do a lot of sort of physical descriptions, but just some of those little details that kind of give you a sense of who they are.
I would just say, I don't think any of us set out to write a strong character, but you just channel it. Just let the character speak and think and do, and other people will let you know, I think, if it's strong or not.
Yes. Okay, Stan, oh, if you like. All of you is, who are your favorite strong female characters in literature?
Excellent question. I was just thinking that. I'm sorry if I can interject as the moderator. Yeah, it's for me. It always comes back to Lily Bart in The House of Mirth, who may not seem strong, right? I mean, Lily's death still, every time I think about it. But she is someone who had to grapple with circumstance, to grapple with the society games in her life in New York in the 19th century. And she has to learn to negotiate individually. And so it just, I think that's such a great question, because I think the answers will show how different strong female protagonists can be, and they don't look the same in every era, do they?
Yeah, definitely not. There's certainly so many. It's like asking what's my favorite book, and I'm just always like, I don't know. But one that always comes to mind in terms of strong women is Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. Janie Crawford she is a force to be reckoned with in a time when women were not supposed to be, aggressive or strong, in any way, but she really finds a path to, just kind of forge forward with her own desires.
I don't know, because I'm reading a book a week. It's hard to.
I want to
hard.
say, oh,
Go.
okay, finish.
No. Jane Eyre, pulling it out of the air, I don't know. There's so many. Go ahead, I can't.
I want to say, I keep forgetting what her name, but Dolores Price in She's Come Undone by Wally Lamb. Oh my gosh, I was so impressed with her. She had such a difficult childhood, and she becomes enormously overweight, and she just keeps going, and she becomes out so strong. Another character who really influenced me is from the Icelandic sagas, actually. And she's one of those really nasty women, and I somehow admired her for her nastiness. When her husband, this is Njál saga, and her name is Hallgerður, and her husband is defending himself against his enemies with a bow and arrow. The string on his bow broke. And he turns to Hallgerður and says, "Give me a strand of your hair so I may string my bow." And she says, "Now I remember that slap that you gave me. I care not whether you defend yourself longer or shorter." And she was really nasty. She was bitchy.
So all I can think of now are all the non-strong female protagonists that I like. One of my favorite books is The Mayor of Casterbridge. I don't know why. I really like Thomas Hardy. I like him because he wrote about the underclass for the bourgeois, and he made them real people, and he made people feel their pain. But then you think of Tess of D'Urberville, was she a strong female character? No, not really. Elizabeth Jane Farfrae from The Mayor of Casterbridge, she wasn't really a strong female character either. So I'm thinking, well, maybe I just kind of like, that's what you write in opposition to. You take your heroes from literary world that you wish would be better, and you write them better.
Excellent question. I wish we could have, that would be another lovely panel to have with a big set of people. But another question, please. Right back there. Oh, what a great question.
What was it again?
What advice would you give to men who would like to write strong female characters?
Yeah.
Start with I. I did this, I did that. Pretend you are her. See how it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just thinking of the humanity of the character. Don't get stuck into stereotypes, and make sure that you have a woman read what you've written, because she'll be able to guide you.
No, I was going to say the same thing. Make sure you have women check it out afterwards and keep working at it. Because it's great when I think I'm reading a female author and I'm reading a male author, because he's done such a brilliant job. So, and vice versa.
I'd say just write her as a character. Write her honestly and truly just as a character, and not as somebody who's got a role to play in the plot, who's got to carry a certain part of the plot, but as a whole person.
Yes, definitely. Not just because, hey, I want to write about some aspect of female experience. I think that's really important. Great question. Next one. All the way back.
Piggybacking on that, how did each of you manage the male presence in the story? Because, the balance in storytelling is really where the magic is. So you don't want just stereotypical characters or reactionary characters to whatever the man is going to say. How did you balance the male presence in the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I first started writing the book, I really thought it was just going to be a story about Kenya and Ghana. And then Bet kind of, sort of nudged her way in. And so I thought, okay, it's these three women who are going to be, going through this experience. And then Malcolm, who is the father, he made himself known. He kind of nudged his way in, and I really started getting intrigued by who he was and how he, is this patriarch of these women who are varied and strong in very different ways. And so I think in some respects he kind of helped balance them in some ways, but yeah, it's sort of an interesting dynamic. And then, of course, there was Ryan, who is the white police officer that Ghana is in a relationship with. And I brought him into the story because I really wanted Ghana to be challenged a little bit by this interracial relationship, while she's also experiencing this sort of Black Lives Matter movement, that's kind of arising in her. But yeah, I mean, it sort of goes back to the same sort of question, it's looking at these men as real, rounded, fully rounded human beings who are in relationship with these women and not just props. And they, for me, they certainly became, so much more in the story than just the love interest or just the father.
And by the way, I don't want to put pressure on you to all have to answer each and every question. If you don't want to, feel free, then we can go on. But if you do have responses to this, I think they would be great to hear.
I was just going to say that I love being in the skin of the male characters, because there's a male love interest in this one. I don't write from his point of view, but as an author, I have to be him. And I have to be him in these difficult situations. And I find it a fun exercise.
Love that. Right back here. Yes.
I have a question about the point when you finish your writing to present it to the publisher process. Was it an easygoing process? Because we don't have many, we have a lot of stories that into a protagonist, they just not made it on the show. And so there's obviously some barrier there. So did you have to do a lot of explaining, make sales? Tell me how that process feedback.
A barrier to difference in publishing? I have no idea what she's talking. I'm kidding, of course. I think this is a great question. And I think it's a great question to ask of authors who are working with smaller independent presses as well, because, for example, Unnamed Press, who published Famous Adopted People, Alice's novel is one that I really look to for some amazing characters who are strong in very many diverse areas. So I think this is a great one for everyone to take on.
I'll just start. I had 61 rejections from pretty much every single fucking publishing house in this country. You know, it was really hard, and most of the editors are women. That's the thing. And one of the most common things was, she's just not likable.
Yeah, me too. So I was trying to get an agent for Malawi Sisters, and I guess it was 30 plus agents that I sent to, most of them women, but the response back was, oh, I love this, but I just can't quite connect with the characters.
Yeah, full disclosure, I broke down and self-published because I just got fed up with all the rejections and repeatedly trying and crafting the perfect query letter, which I just couldn't manage after a while. And I kept shelving the book like it's just going to sit on my computer. And then I realized, no, I could die tomorrow and my computer will get wiped and no one will see anything I've done. So it was like, screw it. I'm just going to self-publish and I'm going to push it, and that's what we're going to do.
My book was first published in Iceland, in Icelandic, and that was a lot of work getting that published there. It's published by the same publisher as my earlier book, and promoting it there, and I was just exhausted after all that. I felt like, I don't want to go through this again. So I found this wonderful hybrid press named Bacon Books Press, and Michelle Orwin is the publisher there, and I've been extremely pleased. I love the cover. I love the way the editing was done. Michelle is sitting right back there. So I was very
Don't
happy.
swarm her.
So I was very happy with my decision.
It is a wonderful cover, it really is. So we have time for 2 more questions. So got one in the front row here and then one in the back, and then maybe we can squeeze one more in, please.
First, I wanted to thank each of you for being so generous with your time and your ideas, sharing them with us. And my sense is that there are a lot of writers in the room. So I would love for each of you to speak to your individual process. I mean, the rigid right down to the amount of time that you write. And if you could share with us from soup to nuts how long it took for you to get that book written.
All right, and you're going to encapsulate this in 20 words.
Okay, real quick. So I actually went on a 30-day writing retreat in Bali and wrote about 50,000 words there. I was totally focused. It was fabulous. But then it took me another 2 years to kind of go through, flesh it out, edit it, et cetera. So yeah, it was a 2.5-year process.
As I said, this book came out really quickly. I wrote it in 10 months. I had an agent. She submitted it many times. It didn't get picked up. I put it away. Trump got elected. I told my agent, you got to bring it out again because this book is really relevant. And she did it again, but she still didn't sell it. I submitted this cold submission to the slush pile, and it got picked up. 5 years.
I wrote this particular book in a year, but it languished for a couple decades because I kept stopping and starting with it. So, and I mean, currently I've got another one, as I said, coming out of me, and it just pours all in a rush. But then it could take years with editing and submitting.
Mine took about 25 years. from start to finish. It started as nonfiction. Then I had several different protagonists in charge of the story, and I kept changing them. But now that I'm working on something else, I work about 3 hours a day, and after 3 hours, nothing new comes out. And so I just stop then. So it's approximately 3 hours, but I try to do it every day. So much of it is revision.
Thank you. In the back.
Yes, hi. This sort of piggybacks on the question before the last question. What were the qualities that the editor was not considering in the book?
What a good question, and probably we could all, everything, but let's talk about it specifically.
Honestly, they didn't go into that much detail. They just said they couldn't connect with the characters. Now, was that, was there sort of a racial barrier there? Most of the editors or agents are white. My characters are black. I don't know. But yeah, I wish I knew.
Yeah, I think it's just the kind of excuse that they use. It's the, that's the good excuse that's there to use, and then they don't have to explain, oh, I didn't connect with the black characters, or my kids are adopted and I didn't like your view of adoption, or whatever. They just say they're unlikable and that's it.
Yeah, me too.
Well, there was one last question, Mary Kay. You get to ask it, and then we're going to have to close and have you all speak to the authors and buy their books. And maybe buy their books is the first thing before you speak to them. But go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for moderating, and what a terrific panel. Really enjoyed being here. So I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum, talking about how did you sell it and how long did it take on. I want to go to the very beginning of the spectrum and talk about voice, and just tell me about getting that voice. And I sort of think that some of the characters in some of your novels, most of which I've read, are kind of fabulously unlikable. And really strong, really in-your-face kind of way. I mean, Lisa is, to say she's unlikable is kind of a compliment, right?
Because she's kind of impossible.
And so anyway, I just want to hear about voice, capturing that voice when it comes to you, to craft your
So yeah, with me it was really, this was a book that I was born or adopted to write. So it just
There's the pull quote.
came out of me. I didn't really give a lot of thought to what was coming out. So in a way, Lisa is a lot like me, but she's also, it was fun because I could exaggerate all the things and make her even more terrible than I was, and also more charming or whatever. But yeah, it was just, that the voice was just something that was already living inside me.
As I said to the questioner before, starting with I is really important, especially if the character is not very much like you, but maybe somebody you'd like to be. So I just tried very hard to understand how a character would respond to repeated frustration or abuse or whatever, or difficult circumstances. And it was a constant question. But I developed this emotion in her, which was anger and assertiveness. Okay, I'm angry, but I'm going to do something about it. And somehow that helped me to be her as I wrote. Does that make sense?
In the immortal words of John Lydon, anger is an energy. So anyone else want to respond to that? Because if not, we can get started in having individual conversations. So I want to thank Solveig, Leslie, Alice, and Melanie for being here with me today, and thank the Writers Center for the time and space to have this wonderful panel, and all of you for coming out on a holiday weekend afternoon to listen and dialogue with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethanne.
Thanks very much.